Alright, now we're going to talk about Agave apps. So probably the most important place to go for documentation is this. So it's developer.agave.api.co. So this has a lot of reference material for the Agave API. So if you want to, for example, figure out exactly what goes in your Agave files, how to format that, then you would want to go here. Now, what made this documentation difficult to use at first is that there wasn't a whole lot on actually making. There wasn't really a tutorial on how to make an Agave app from scratch. This is basically just a reference to all the different parts of it, but not as much on how to put them together. So that's mainly the main difficulty of this. Otherwise, once you sort of know how to put everything together, then this becomes fairly useful. So I wanted to use this one as an example. So
now we could check the hours.
Okay, so we're going to use the optimization model app as an example. So when you start an app, just make a folder with whatever name you want to call it. The name of the folder doesn't matter much. So there are 5 files in every Agave app. You probably won't need to worry about the job. If you're submitting the job on the portal, then this job file isn't needed. This job file is only if you want to go through the Agave CLI. So, for example, for that file, we would do, for example, /jobs. Something like that. Forgot exactly of jobs -run, I think. Run this. But okay. So I forgot exactly what thing that is. But you would do something like that, and then with the file. But if we're working with the portal, then we don't need to worry about that. So the main files we're going to be interested in then are going to be these 4. And then for further simplification, the test file is usually blank. I don't really. So this is, I believe this code is run when, as I was saying before, when you register the file with Agave. So when you do the command apps-add-update, when you do this command, I believe it executes the test file. And that's just if you want to test any code before you run the whole app. But I don't think we'll need to do that. For us, there's a better way to test the code anyway, and that's going to attack the visualization portal. So you'll have a nice desktop where you can run whatever code you want and test that instead of going to the command line. So I would recommend just to leave the test file blank. Or it's not exactly blank. You put hash !bin/bash. That's just standard for bash files, which are .sh files. but the content of it is blank. So just make sure you have this there, and then you won't really have to worry about this. Like I said, I don't think there's really much of a circumstance where we'll need to actually have code in there. And you can name all the files whatever you want, just as long as you're consistent, meaning that if, for example, this file might reference the job file or the metadata file, so just make sure that in the content of this file, when it's asking for the metadata file, that you're inputting the correct name. But otherwise, as long as you're consistent through the files, you can name them whatever you want.
Actually, can you please repeat one more time what's the purpose of the wrapper file?
The wrapper, so the wrapper file is what actually executes the code on Stampede or whatever execution system. See, so I can get to that second. So let's move the job and the test files over here, since these are generally not needed for us. So now the primary files that we will be using are the definition, metadata, and wrapper. So for this one, for this app, this is the definition file. This is the metadata file, and this is the wrapper file. See, I'm not too sure exactly where to start. Actually, I would like to start with the definition, because it kind of defines the whole application. So one thing that we will have available in for everyone at T-Surrey is just a template file for the definition and metadata files. So the template will basically have probably all of this, but just without entries, and it will have tags, ontology, inputs. All this will be deleted. All this will be deleted, and then outputs. And so you won't necessarily have to create everything from scratch. But I can still go through, now I can go through what all these things mean. So this is the ID. This is what will actually be referenced within Agave. So the ID, you can call it basically whatever you want, but make sure it's different from any of the other apps already in Agave. The name, I believe the name is what will show up here in the actual box for the app. And you can call that whatever you want. So parallelism, so you can choose either parallel or serial, and I would recommend just choosing parallel, just to make sure you can use all the power of all the nodes. Then the version, that can also be whatever you want. This is, I think, so you can have different different apps of the same name, but different versions of them. So you can keep track of changes or different functionalities between different versions or whatever you need for that. Label. Okay, so actually I misspoke on the name. The label is what's actually shows up here. So it shows a label and then actually shows the version. So for example, if you want to, if you put 2.0 here and then register that with Agave using apps at update, then it will show up here with optimization model 2.0. So for example, what I was talking about earlier, that's how you can, if you wanted to skip deleting the metadata file, as I was showing earlier, then you can just change the version in the definition, and in the metadata file will have the same thing, 2.0, for example, and then it will just show up the same app, both 2.0. So, let's see then, description, just use the name of or what you put up here. It's not really, it doesn't really matter much. As public and available should be set to true, and make sure they will show up in here when you refresh the workspace. App category, this app category is would just be for this. I was trying earlier to make different categories here. If we get that running, then you can put the category there, and then that will show up here, and you can choose a category, and then that app will be listed only under that category. But for now, that really doesn't matter. Now we get more to the meat of what's of the definition file. So you have the default node count. This is how many nodes are used on the execution system. So a node is basically a cluster of, or a processor with its own RAM and a bunch of cores to use. I would recommend using just one node, because I think if you use more than one node, then you start to have to figure out how to connect them using like MPI or something like that. Now, if you know how to do that, then you can use multiple nodes. Default memory per node is in gigabytes. Now, one thing for these are have to do with the specifications for the for everything, for the for all the tax systems. So if you want to look at the specifications, you go to the TAC user portal, documentation, and then go to, say, Stampede 2, since that's what we're using, and then you will get the specifications. So I think it defaults to KNL nodes. So KNL has 96 gigabytes of RAM, of basic RAM here. So that's why I put 96 in default memory per node. Default processors per node is the number of threads to use for each node, and that's 272, which I got from here. Hardware threads per node, 272. Default processors is basically the same thing as this, so just enter the same number there. Default queue is normal. There are some different queues. I think debug is another one. You'd have to look through the documentation to find the names of all that, but I think for most cases you can leave that as normal. There's a default max runtime. Now that I think I changed in the final version, but this will be the maximum runtime that you can enter in here. So, for example, if you enter the absolute maximum runtime in any case is 48 hours, but you can set a lower maximum runtime for the app, for this particular app, through that setting. So, for example, this one will be 30 minutes, and if you enter a number larger than 30 here, then it will complain. But that's separately for each app.
And that's the purpose of defining the numbers, is to kind of expedite the job when you go to the queue?
No, it's just to, well, this one is just the max runtime, so just the maximum time the user can specify for the job to run.
I think that's a default. Like, I think you can put more than
Yeah, in the final version, I put more than that.
that. Right?
Yeah. Like I was saying, the absolute default max runtime globally is 48 hours. But I was just saying you can specify a value lower if you need to for this. Otherwise, just put 48 here. So just put 48 and then all the rest is zeros for that. Would be probably the.
So that's the maximum time, but then the user will enter a time, and would that affect how fast it will be processed at SMP?
I'm not sure. Actually, I think so. So I think what might happen is longer run times might take longer in the queue. It won't affect the performance of the app.
Oh yeah, yes.
But the queue, yes. So I think, for example, if you want to,
Just to be mindful of that, don't put 48 hours is the maximum time that it might affect how fast it's processed.
Yeah.
You don't need that time.
But for example, you can still specify 48 here,
Yeah.
and then when you run the app, you would specify maybe an hour here instead. This is just that was just the maximum that you can enter into the field for this app. The deployment path is going to be the folder, the path of the folder that you're using to store the files in your data debugged. So for example, here it's / optimization model app 2. So these are the folder containing the files. So for that entry, you would put / optimization model app 2. So / the name of the folder, assuming that the folder is located in the root of your data depot. But otherwise, you would just put the path to the folder. Maybe it might be /2 / that or whatever. But for this one, it's just / and then the folder. Deployment system. This is the ID for the storage system that we created. I can go over the storage, setting up storage and execution systems in another video. But similar to this, you create a JSON file with the ID for your systems, and then you enter that ID here. So, for example, the ID we're using for Corral for deployment system is the storage system, or whatever system contains the files. You could actually use Stampede too for this if you want, but we're using Corral. So the ID for that is utsa.tsurrey.corral. The execution system is, of course, the execution system that you're using to run the app. So that's utsa.tsurrey.stampede2. Execution type is CLI because we're just executing from the command line. So basically, what that means is that the wrapper file is basically just a bunch of command line commands. So that's what that means. So template path is the name and path of the wrapper file, but the path is relative to the deployment path. So this file is in this folder, so we just have the name of the file. Otherwise, if you have subfolders in this folder, then you would do / subfolder / and then that file. But again, that's relative. That path is relative to what you have up here. So, for example, the template path is called optimization model wrapper 2.sh. So, in our optimization model app folder, we have that right here, optimization model wrapper 2.sh. And that's what I was saying earlier, is that you can name them whatever you want as long as you put the right name everywhere that is required. Test path is a path for the test file. It still requires this even if the content is blank. So just make sure you have that file as explained earlier, and then that you upload to the folder, and then that's right here, optimization model test2.sh. Again, the path of this is relative to your deployment path. So checkpointable, I'm not too sure what that is, but it's just false. Just keep it like that. Now for all of these different things here, you can reference the documentation probably. So go to apps. Let's see. So I'm not too sure where it has all these other things. So you have this. The next section is modules. I think we can always leave that blank. The section after that is tags. I think we can always leave that blank. Ontology, same thing, leave that blank. But then after that is the important one, and that's inputs. So this is one that you can reference in the documentation. So you go to apps, inputs and parameters, and it will give you a bunch of different settings and things like that for that. So these inputs here are basically file inputs. So for example, the first one corresponds to this first one right here. So these are the ones that you'll drag and drop files into. So these only require an ID and details and then a label. And the label is what shows up in here, right here. And so for inputs, that's basically all you need. So for example, here's a block for this input, and then you put a comma, and then you have another block for that input, and then a comma, and then for the final one though, you don't put a comma, and then it's closed by the brace here. And then after that, the next section are the parameters. It's opened by a brace, and then you have the brackets corresponding to that enclose each parameter. So the parameters are just values. So for example, enter the base here, that's a parameter. You just enter a number, for example, and it treats that as a string. So you can't put files into there, but they're basically just variables. So for the parameters, this would be, for example, a block for one parameter for the base here. So you need an ID, and then you need this value section here. You need to know whether it's required. You can set, if you want the field to be optional, you'd set this to false. If you require an input to the field, then you set that to true. You have the type is string. And then I think for the definition file, you will always have type string. But for the metadata file, this is where you would, if you need selection boxes, this would be different. Visible, set that to true. That means whether the field actually shows up when generated in the form. And then a default value, I think the default value is only needed if required is true. And then you have the details section here, which just has the label. And of course, again, the label is what shows up above the field. So there are also other settings that you can put for both inputs and parameters in order to customize it. But these settings are only what you absolutely need. So if you want to see what other settings you can do for inputs and parameters in reference to documentation. These have the different things here. Like for example, here are all the different things that you could enter for the input field. So for example, you have the ID. So ID, you have details. Details is right here. Details.label, for example, is like this, details, and then brackets or curly braces, and then label, and then close it with curly braces. So for JSON files, they're basically like key value pairs. So you have the name of the name of the variable in quotes, and then a colon, and then quotes the value of that. So this means that the value of the label is this string. And you can look up online just how general JSON files are formatted. There's basically just a bunch of key value pairs separated by curly braces and these little brackets and things here. So for example, you can have different, this shows the different things. So for example, if you want to add a description, I'm not too sure exactly where that would go in the form, but if you need a description, then you see it's details.description. So you go to the details, and then you would do, let's see, comma, enter, and do, what is it, description, do like this, description, and have whatever you want your description to be. So, let's see, file for, and then since it's the last one in the list, you don't do a comma. So if you want to add different things like that, that's how you would do that. Let's see. And you just do the same thing for each parameter you need until you get to the end of the parameter section. And the final section is the outputs, and this is something that still isn't supported really for so much for Agave. The main thing it's used for is, I think, for signaling. For example, signaling other apps if you want to do a workflow. So basically like chaining apps together. But it's not exactly fully supported by Agave. That was what Josue was telling me. So you don't need to worry about the outputs usually, so just leave that blank. And then that's the end of the definition file. Let's see. So many of these I think are required. If you look in the documentation, you can probably see what's required and what's not. So for example, the ID in the description, it says it's required. But for example, many of the others aren't required. This one's required. So you can see which ones you can omit and which ones you need a value for. And then just like the inputs and parameters, you can see any other things you need to, or you might want to add to this. So these are basically like the general settings for the app, and then you have like the different parts of the app and the rest of the file. So you can basically sort of split it into two sections. This first, general settings, and then all the parts of the app. So the parts would be like the modules part, the tags part, inputs part, parameters part. And again, you really only need to worry about the inputs and then the parameters, and you can leave the other parts blank. So I think that's it for the definition file. Are there any questions? So now we can go to the metadata file. This one should be a lot quicker. So for apps that we're only using, I'm doing that. For apps that we only use text fields like this, then most of the metadata file will be copy and pasted from the definition file. So you start the file with this curly brace, then you have name, ds apps. This name will always be the same for our use, I think. This basically is the name of the apps list that will appear here. So basically these, all these apps are stored under the name apps, ds_apps. For example, we can make another list of apps that will appear instead of this one if we do, say, dsapps2, and then we would modify the portal code so that it picks up all the apps under the name dsapps2, and then those apps will appear here instead of these. But otherwise, I think we will just keep one list of apps and under this name, and so for our use, I think always leave that the same. Then value is all this here. So type will always be Agave, so leave that the same. And then you have the definition, which again is basically copied from the actual definition file. So if you look at the whole thing, it's essentially it is the same thing all the way down to the end, and then you just close it with 2 curly braces. So it's extremely simple if all you need are text fields. Now, where this got complicated is where I did drop-down boxes. So, for example, if I find one that has that. So these, for example, drop-down boxes, the metadata file will be different. You can copy from the definition file, but then you have to modify your parameters in order to reflect the drop-down boxes. And I can show how to do that in a separate video. But otherwise, I think that's it for the metadata.
So this will work for CSV files and for actual values, right? You can use this entering directly to the fields.
Yes. We can do more than CSV files, but we can do any kind of file. But
for our purpose.
So finally, then we get to the wrapper file. So the wrapper file always starts with this line up here, which basically lets the computer know that it's a bash script. And then you'll always start with a blank file. So for this, there won't be any template beyond just this first line here. And the rest of the files the rest of the lines are what you expect the execution system to run. So you just put whatever code you want it to run in here. So, for example, ignore all this. You just type in the code, and this is basically code that would run in a command line type environment, like that. So yeah, that's pretty much it in general. Now for this particular app, One thing to note about Stampede 2 is that if you want to use R, you have to use this line before you do anything with R. So you do module load R stats. And then same with Python. If you want to use anything with Python, Python 3, for example, you do module load Python 3. I think for Python 2, it's probably just Python. And then, for example, any type of command that you can do in Linux on the command line, you can do here. So, for example, I was doing the move command here to move a file. And this is the same thing you can do on a terminal. So the first major thing here is the R, is calling the R script. So if you want to run an R script, you do capital R and then script space your name of the file. General. So this file is actually placed in. So you have to make sure that that file, if you want to hard code that into the wrapper or into the app, so that it always uses this exact same file, then you have to upload it to the folder, to your app folder here. So that file is, yeah. So that file is here.
What is that? What are you doing with that?
So for this, for all this, I'm taking the parameters that the user input, or in the optimization model, all the parameters that the user input, and generating a CSV file with all those parameters. So let's see. So if instead you're using a user file, then what you would do is say the file here. Let's see. So for that, you would do something like this, but with the ID. So say you want say instead here you want to run a script. Let's see, well, that's a script. Well, say for example you want to run a script that the user supplied, and say just for example that file is entered here in this first input. So you would go to your your definition file. You would go to that input. So that input is called supplier coordinates, and then let's see. Okay. Let's see. So then you do quotes. Let's see, $, bracket, supplier coordinates, exactly the way it's spelled in the definition file, and then that will run the script for that. And again, this is just a hypothetical example where this first field expects an R script, and then from the user, and then you want to run that. But in this case, in this actual case that we're doing, we're using the same file over and over again. This isn't a file that's expected from the user, and so we actually just simply upload that to the folder for your app. Again, it's right there, and then you can just hard code the name of the exact name of the file right there. Now the rest of these are arguments for the R script. So the R script will see these and gather up all the information from that. So so all these are parameters, not inputs, for the app. Now, for example, it's the same way of referencing those. So, for example, for base year, so say you enter 2019 for base year, when you want to reference that, again, you go to your definition file, you find the parameter for base year, and well, that happens to be the ID. So you see your ID is base year, spelled like that. So to reference it in the wrapper file, you do quote, $, curly brace, then the ID, and curly brace, end quote. And then when this actually runs, since the user inputted 2019 here, this here will be basically replaced by 2019. So that references the value that the user input into that field. And then the rest basically follow that same idea. So for this R script aggregate supply, the aggregate supply file is here. That's hard coded and stored in the app folder. And then as arguments, it's using these two parameters from the app form. And so this aggregates the supply for each county, since there are multiple supply entries for the counties. And then the next one generates the input files for for Julia. So this is actually a Python file. So to run a Python script, you just do Python 3, and then the name of your script. And again, this script is hard-coded, meaning that it's we're using the same one each time. So we upload that to the app folder, and that is right here, generate input files.py right there. So for debugging purposes, I think I hard-coded in the general parameters. So I'm not too sure where those are. But for the rest, our user supplied, or actually except for this. But anytime you want to put the name, just the name, the plain name of the file, you need to make sure it's in the folder for the app. Otherwise, if it's a file supplied by the user, you have to make sure that you have this correct format of the $, curly braces, and quotes, and then make sure you're referencing the correct ID for that input or parameter from the definition file. Then after that, I call an R script, readblanks.r. This is just to make sure there aren't any blanks in one of the files, because that was showing up and creating errors. So that's just something, that was just a check that I put there. And then finally, you have the Julia script. Now this one is a bit different than than all these scripts here. And that's because this script actually lives on Stampede 2 rather than Corral. I think. Oh, sorry, not this one, but this. So this is actually the Julia executable. Now this is what lives on Stampede 2. This right here is the file that lives on Corral, and that's right here in your app folder. But the executable for Julia, not the Julia file, but the executable lives on Stampede 2. So you need to reference the correct path to that file within Stampede 2. So for example, it's /home1 / all this in Julia. Now,
Mark, for the record, if we would like to change Julia to, let's say, ample gaps will be, I guess that goes back to the fact, if we don't have the executable, what's going to be the alternative?
Well, you would install it on Stampede 2, and then you would reference the executable here, and then the file. So for this, you would go into the visualization portal, and then from there you can modify all of the files on Stampede 2. Now the visualization portal will take you to, let's see, for example, this path, and then when you click on the home file and the home directory in the desktop, and then you will see this directory and then the other ones. Now, one thing here is I think you might need to do this on my Stampede 2 version, and not anyone else's, I think. And so if you want to change this, change any of the files that affect it within Stampede 2 that affect the apps, I think you'll need to go into my account instead of your personal TAC account in order to do that.
And it's also remind me, Julie is called Cplex, but we don't have the securable for Cplex like that.
Oh no, we do actually. That's actually how we were doing it in the first place. We were actually calling I think we were calling the Julia file first. That was the retrieve data, and then after that, so instead here it was retrieve data, and after that we were actually calling the Cplex executable by itself. And then later on we changed that so that we're calling Cplex within Julia. Now I don't know why we did that, but that was with you and Mario. Let's see. So I think that's pretty much it for all the files. For the documentation, useful sections will be the apps section. So that gives you your inputs and parameters, all the things you can put in the JSON file. Let's see. So one thing to note is that for the definition file, it needs to only contain things that Agave recognizes. So it should only contain things like in here. I'm not too sure where exactly it has all this stuff. But if you put something, say, just, custom key, custom value, I believe it will complain. So you can't really add things to this beyond what Agave expects. Now, if you want to have your own sort of, custom information about the app for your own use, then you'd want to go into the metadata file. And then the metadata file, you can add whatever you want. So for example, here you can add a custom value, and then custom key, which would be a colon. And then it won't complain. So that is connected to the drop-down boxes, because with the drop-down boxes, I'm adding a bunch of, what I'm doing is I'm adding extra details to the parameters that the portal then reads in order to generate the drop-down boxes. But those extra details are not official Agave, values or keys. And so if you put those in the definition file, that won't, Agave will complain about it. So to summarize that, if you want to do anything fancy or custom with the forms, in the portal, then anything for that will be in the metadata file. And that's where I was saying you could copy the definition from the definition file into the metadata file and then edit that. They can be different. And so that was kind of linking to what I was saying in the thesis defense. So again, back to the documentation. You have inputs and parameters, and then it has something about wrapper templates. Actually, it does have a section, I think, on modules. That's, I guess, here. Yeah, packaging. It kind of sort of goes through an example, but it's not really detailed. Let's see. So here you see the things from the metadata, more about inputs and parameters, permissions, publishing an app. Haven't exactly got to that point yet, but I don't think we need to worry about that. And then after apps, the next section is jobs. This will be especially important if you're submitting a job on the command line. But otherwise, we don't need to worry about the jobs section. It has a whole section actually for metadata. Let's see. The other important thing will be systems, but this is only if you need to register new storage and execution systems to Agave. So for example, if we want to use Maverick or Wrangler instead of Stampede 2, then you'll want to do a new execution system. But I'll probably create a new different video for that, since that's kind of separate from the actual Agave apps. And otherwise, let's see. I can go through the job file just to be thorough. So the job file is very simple. This is, I think, all that's, well, you will need, I think, the value for the parameters here. But otherwise, we can just have a template sort of for this. Again, it's a JSON file. So for name, you can put whatever you want. That's just the name of the job. For the app ID, what goes in the app ID is what you have in the definition file, the ID, and then you put dash the version number. So this is for a different app. But for example, the ID for this one was Julia Test, then dash the version was 0.1. For inputs, if you have any inputs in your definition file, you will need to put, I think you will do, for example, I can't remember exactly, but the ID for the inputs. ID, and then you will need, I think, the path. The path for the file. Now, if you don't have any inputs, then you can leave that blank as it is here. Archive. Actually, you'll probably want to set archive to true. This means that it will send the output files to a certain location. This, for example, is basically the same thing that we're doing here at the end. This job output archive location. So if you do archive true, you will also need to put the path that you want to archive. I'm not too sure what the key for that one is, but you can probably find it in the documentation. Parameters, you need to put in the value for each parameter that you define, assuming that it's required. So, for example, you do parameter ID, and then whatever you want the parameter to be, say 2019. Say, actually, for example, you do base here for this ID, or this parameter here, and then say 2019. But if you don't have any parameters, you can leave that blank as it is here. And then notifications, you can leave blank, and that's it. Now, if especially for the inputs and parameters, it might be different than what I said, because as I was saying, you don't need to use this unless you're submitting the job through the command line interface, through here. So I never really used this, so I might be wrong on a few things there. But otherwise, you can look that up probably under jobs in the documentation, and that will tell you more exactly what goes where. And let's see, to run a job, let's see, submission. So also, you can see example code here on the right-hand side. You're going to choose CLI. And this is example code for using the Agave CLI. So to submit a job, you do jobs-submit-f, and the file for your job. So for example, within your CLI bin folder here, you do /jobs-submit-f. Yeah, and then the path com/file.json, and then enter, and then that will submit the job. Let's see, as a note, I think for apps add update and metadata add update, I think I had done -f like that. I think it should be -F as it's shown. For example, here, that usually means that it's a JSON file. Let's see. So actually, let's see. It might be an example here. Okay, yeah, I can't find that, but I think it's when you do apps add update, it's this capital F. It's actually a capital F like that.
Is this found once? In the command line?
Yes. Again, though, that's for updating or submitting the definition file. So anytime you edit the definition file, you will have to go and do that again.
To submit, you just have to do you have to do the definition file either way.
Yeah.
And once you submit it, after that, if you want to change it, you have to do
Yeah. So another thing to note about the apps at update is that for the definition file, So when you're updating the definition file with apps update, when you're updating the definition file, that will actually replace the old version of that. So you don't need to worry about going back and deleting your old definition file. However, for the metadata file, it's different. For the metadata file, when you do metadata add update, it will actually add a new metadata file. So I can't remember, I think maybe I was doing this at the end of the last video, so I'll do it again for this video. So what you'll want to do is, because it doesn't replace the previous file for the metadata, you'll have to go back and delete the previous file and then submit the new change the edited metadata file. So you're going to want to do metadata dash list dash v. V will actually show all the metadata for each file. So you scroll through it and look through for the names of each app. So for example, when you scroll up, you can find under label or name, it's the origin destination CSV maker. This is just an example. So once you find the name of the app you're looking for, you go up to the UUID and then copy that. And then go back down, and then you do /metadata-delete, and then paste the UUID.
Yeah.
And then that will get rid of that entry, and then you can do /metadata-update-f, and then your metadata file. And then I think that's pretty much it I have to say for Agave apps. Alright, so any questions?